The peaceful morning swim turned into a nightmare in an instant. The water shifted, the current pulling in strange directions. A shadow emerged from the depths, its sheer size paralyzing. The ocean erupted as the predator struck, leaving no time to escape. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The humid warmth of Cozumel hit Mark Sullivan the moment he stepped off the small commuter plane. He paused at the edge of the tarmac, letting the salty breeze sweep over him. It carried the faint aroma of seaweed and distant reefs, a scent that promised adventure and mystery. Adjusting the strap of his duffel bag, Mark felt his excitement rise. He had dreamed of this trip for years, scouring forums, watching videos, and preparing for the experience of diving in one of the world's most renowned underwater paradises. The cab ride to the marina was a blur of vibrant color. Bright buildings painted in yellows and blues, palm trees swaying lazily, and tourists in beachwear chatting outside cafes. But it was the ocean that held Mark's gaze. The water sparkled like liquid glass, revealing glimpses of the reefs below. "This is it," Mark muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "What's that?" the cab driver asked in heavily accented English. "Oh, just saying how beautiful it is here," Mark replied, smiling. "Sí, muy bonito," the driver said, nodding. "But you respect the ocean, see? Many things live there. Some dangerous." Mark chuckled. "Don't worry, I've done plenty of dives. I'll be fine." The driver didn't press the matter, but his silence was weighted with something Mark couldn't quite place: concern, perhaps, or maybe just the quiet wisdom of someone who understood the ocean's unpredictable nature. At the marina, Mark was greeted by the rhythmic clinking of boat rigging and the calls of gulls circling above. Carlos Ortega, a grizzled but fit dive guide, stood waiting near a small boat named Undisfer Azul Profundo and Sir. He extended a hand as Mark approached. "You must be Mark," Carlos said, his voice warm but firm. "Welcome to Cozumel. You ready for tomorrow?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Mark replied, shaking Carlos's hand. "I've been planning this for years. I can't wait to see the reefs." Carlos smiled but didn't quite mirror Mark's enthusiasm. "You'll see the reefs, but there are rules, strict ones. You listen to me, you stay within the group, and you don't wander. Clear?" Mark nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation at Carlos's tone. He wasn't some novice diver. He had logged dozens of dives across the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. "Got it," he said. "Cunt." Carlos motioned toward the boat. "We leave early. Be here by 6 a.m. sharp. And tonight, I'll give you a quick briefing at the cafe across the street. Sound good?" "Perfect," Mark said, hoisting his duffel bag onto his shoulder. That evening, Mark found Carlos sitting at a small outdoor table under a flickering string of lights. The cafe bustled with tourists and locals alike, the air filled with laughter and the scent of grilled fish. Carlos waved him over. "I ordered ceviche. You eat?" Carlos asked as Mark sat down. "Love it," Mark replied. "Thanks." Carlos leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Tell me about your diving experience." Mark hesitated, slightly annoyed by the grilling. "I've been diving for almost 6 years. PADI certified, advanced open water. I've done night dives, deep dives, wreck dives, you name it." Carlos nodded slowly. "Good. Then you understand how unpredictable the ocean can be." "Of course," Mark said. Carlos's gaze didn't waver. "Do you know about bull sharks?" Mark shrugged. "Sure. Aggressive, territorial. But attacks are rare, right?" "Rare doesn't mean impossible," Carlos said. "And here, near the reefs, we've had incidents. They come closer this time of year, following the currents. Sometimes, they stay in the shallow waters." Mark frowned. "But we'll be in a group. Sharks don't usually attack groups." "Usually," Carlos said, emphasizing the word. But there are no guarantees in the water. That's why I'm telling you now. Stay within the group. The reefs have marked boundaries for a reason. Beyond them, the water drops fast, and visibility gets tricky. That's their territory. Mark nodded, though he felt a pang of irritation again. He wasn't a reckless thrill seeker, but as Carlos talked, painting vivid pictures of previous encounters with bull sharks, a small part of Mark was intrigued. There was a certain thrill in the idea of brushing against danger, of glimpsing the raw, untamed power of nature. Understood, Mark said when Carlos finished. Carlos gave him a long look, then finally nodded. Good. I'll see you in the morning. The next morning dawned clear and warm, the sun rising over the ocean in a blaze of gold and orange. The small group of divers assembled at the dock, chatting excitedly as they boarded the Unisfer Azul Profundo. Mark recognized a couple of them from the cafe the night before, but most were strangers. Carlos ran through the safety briefing one more time, his tone brisk. Stay close. Watch your buddy. Do not wander off. We'll be diving at Palancar Reef first, then moving to Santa Rosa Wall. Any questions? No one spoke, though a few exchanged nervous glances. Mark, however, was brimming with anticipation. He adjusted his gear as the boat cut through the waves, its motor humming steadily. First time here? A woman named Sarah asked, sitting next to him. Yeah, Mark said, smiling. You? Same. Heard it's amazing, though. It is, Carlos interjected from the helm. But remember, respect the ocean. It's not just beautiful, it's dangerous. When they reached the first dive site, the group descended into the water one by one. The underwater world unfolded before them like a living tapestry. Vibrant coral formations, schools of brightly colored fish, and the occasional turtle gliding serenely past. Mark was in awe. He stayed close to the group at first, but as the dive progressed, he found himself drifting farther, drawn by the allure of untouched corners of the reef. Carlos gestured for him to return, and Mark obliged, though reluctantly. By the time they reached the second dive site, Mark's curiosity had gotten the better of him. Santa Rosa Wall was breathtaking, a sheer drop-off that seemed to descend into infinity. Mark spotted a small cavern off to the side, its mouth dark and inviting. Without thinking, he veered toward it. Marked, Carlos's voice crackled faintly through the radio in his dive mask. Stay with the group. I'll just be a second, Mark called back, his voice muffled. The cavern was mesmerizing, its walls covered in delicate coral fans and darting fish. Mark swam deeper, the rest of the group fading into the blue behind him. He paused, his breath echoing loudly in his regulator. The water here felt different, cooler, heavier. A sudden movement in the shadows caught his eye. A barracuda, sleek and silver, darted past. Mark chuckled, feeling a rush of adrenaline. But as he turned back toward the cavern's entrance, something larger loomed in the distance. And dark, torpedo-like shape moved silently through the water, its presence both commanding and unnerving. Mark froze, his heart pounding. It was a bull shark. Marked, where are you? Carlos's voice came again, more insistent this time. Mark fumbled for his radio. I'm here. I think I just saw a bull shark. Gent back to the group. Now. The urgency in Carlos's voice sent a chill down Mark's spine. He turned, ticking hard toward the exit of the cavern. But the shark wasn't gone. It was circling now, its movements deliberate and unervingly calm. Mark's breathing quickened, his bubbles erupting in frantic bursts around him. As he emerged from the cavern, the shark followed, keeping its distance but not retreating. Stay calm, Carlos's voice urged. Don't panic, just move slowly. Mark obeyed, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. The shark's cold, unblinking eyes followed his every move, a silent reminder of the ocean's merciless power. As he rejoined the group, Carlos positioned himself between Mark and the shark, his spear gun raised. The shark hovered for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the blue. But the encounter left Mark shaken, a stark reminder that the ocean, for all its beauty, was not his domain. The next morning, Mark Sullivan found himself standing at the edge of the Unisfer Azul Profundo Undusser, looking down into the deep blue expanse that stretched before him. The boat rocked gently on the waves as the sun rose high, casting a golden light across the shimmering surface of the water. It was everything he had dreamed of: clear skies, calm seas, the promise of untold wonders below. He could feel his heart quicken in anticipation. Carlos Ortega, the dive guide, was at the helm, his face set in a focused expression. "We're almost there," he called out to the group. "Remember, stay within the safety boundaries. Don't wander off." His tone was firm, more so than usual, and Mark could hear the weight of his words. "Understood?" Mark replied, adjusting his mask and regulator, a nervous excitement bubbling within him. The small group of divers gathered at the back of the boat, checking their gear. There were 3 other tourists, a couple from California named Sarah and Ryan, both in their late 20s, and an older man named Ted, who appeared to be in his 50s but had the look of someone who had dived for decades. Mark had exchanged pleasantries with them the night before, but his focus was now entirely on the dive. Carlos was methodical in his preparations, moving from one diver to the next, ensuring everything was secure. He was a seasoned professional, and Mark couldn't help but admire his calm, efficient demeanor. "Okay, we're here," Carlos said, breaking Mark's thoughts. "To Langkar Reef, one of the most beautiful dives you'll ever do. But again, stay close. We'll start at the shallows and work our way down. The deeper we go, the more dangerous it can get." "Dangerous?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Carlos shot her a sharp look. "Not dangerous if you stay in the right zones. But anything beyond those lines, that's the shark's domain. Stay within the safe areas and we'll be fine." Mark felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle at the mention of sharks. He glanced at Carlos, trying to read his expression, but the guide was already unstrapping his gear. "I'm fine with that," Ryan said with a nervous laugh. "No interest in testing the sharks." Mark gave him a half-smile, but he couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that gnawed at him. Something about the deeper waters called to him, the unknown depths that lay just beyond their safe zone. He wasn't here to play it safe. The group donned their fins and entered the water, one by one, the cold embrace of the ocean swallowing them whole. Mark's breath deepened as the dive boats slowly drifted away from the reef, the water growing darker beneath them. The bright sunlight above began to fade into a dull, muted blue, and the gentle sway of the surface gave way to the eerie stillness of the underwater world. It was beautiful. Mark was in awe. Coral spires stretched up from the seafloor like ancient stone pillars. Vibrant fish darted through the gaps, and schools of parrotfish swam lazily by, their colors flashing like neon. The water was clear and the visibility was perfect, at least for now. He felt weightless, suspended in a realm of tranquility and life. But the deeper they descended, the more he could feel a subtle change, a thickening of the water, a growing sense of emptiness beneath him. He wasn't sure if it was the vastness of the ocean or the deep, growing urge to venture farther, but he found himself pushing forward, away from the group. "Mark," Carlos's voice crackled through his regulator. "Stay with the others." Mark glanced up and saw Carlos pointing toward the rest of the group, signaling for him to return. He nodded and started swimming back toward them, but something deep within him urged him to keep going, to swim a little farther down to see what lay beyond the reef's edge. Carlos had made it clear that the deeper waters held dangers that Mark was more than willing to face. It wasn't just about the reef anymore. He wanted to test his limits, to see just how far he could push himself. The thrill of discovery was stronger than any lingering doubt. Without a second thought, Mark swam beyond the boundary that Carlos had set, moving toward the sheer drop-off of the reef. The water grew darker the farther he went, and deep, almost inky blue that felt like the very abyss itself. The sounds of the ocean seemed to fade, replaced by the steady pulse of his own breath in his regulator. He glanced back, his heart thumping in his chest. The group was a distant blur now, just shapes floating above the coral bed. He was alone, isolated in the vastness of the ocean. He took a deep breath and began his descent into the open water. The further Mark descended, the more intense the silence became. His vision began to adjust to the darker, deeper waters, and he could see the sharp, jagged edges of the reef fall away beneath him. His dive computer flashed warnings about depth, but he ignored them. He had gone beyond the limits before, and nothing ever happened. But this time it felt different. A strange, tingling sensation crept up his spine. There was something out there, something lurking just beyond his reach. Suddenly, a dark shadow swept past him. He froze, his heart racing. It was too fast to identify, but it was larger than any fish he had seen before. Then he saw it again, a flicker in the distance, moving just beyond the reach of his vision. It was there. He was certain of it now. A shark. Mark's pulse quickened. Bull sharks, Carlos had said. Aggressive, territorial. And now he was swimming right into its territory. His breath came faster, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, trying to stay calm. Carlos's voice came through his regulator, distant and frantic. "Mark, come back. Now." Mark's heart hammered in his chest. The shark was close. It was circling, keeping its distance but clearly aware of him. It was large, its muscular body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. He could see the dark, menacing shape of its head, the white flash of its belly as it glided silently through the water. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, his hand gripping his spear gun tightly. It was more for comfort than protection. He knew the shark didn't fear him. He knew he was a visitor in its world. The shark swam around him once more, closer this time. Its eyes locked onto his. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as the creature passed within a few feet of him. He could see its gills flaring, the powerful muscles rippling beneath its skin. It was massive, faster, stronger, and far more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. He kicked harder, trying to swim back to the reef, but the shark was too quick. He shot forward again, this time closing the gap between them, coming within inches of his legs. Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Carlos!" he shouted into his regulator, his voice strained. "Mark, go up. Now!" Carlos's voice was sharp and panicked. Mark kicked desperately toward the surface, but the shark was there, still circling, its movements more aggressive now. It was toying with him, stalking him in the endless blue. His mind raced. He had to get back to the group, but the shark wouldn't let him go. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and for a split second he thought the shark was retreating. But then, the water exploded around him as the shark lunged. In that instant, Mark understood what Carlos had meant. The ocean was not to be respected. It was to be feared, and he was nothing but prey. Mark's body jerked, a sudden, sharp pain ripping through his leg. His mind barely had time to process the sensation before the cold, searing terror flooded his senses. The shark had struck. He felt the powerful, crushing force of its teeth sink into the flesh of his thigh, the sharp edges tearing through the suit and into his muscle. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart thundering in his chest as the blood rushed to his head. The world blurred in a mix of panic and pain, the water turning murky as his own blood clouded around him. The shark's grip was unrelenting, its massive jaws clamped around him, holding him in place as he thrashed helplessly. The suddenness of the attack had sent him into a panic, his mind screaming at him to move, to get away. But the overwhelming power of the creature's bite paralyzed him with fear. His legs kicked wildly, but the water felt sick, as if something was pulling him deeper. In a blur of adrenaline, Mark's training kicked in. He twisted, reaching for his spear gun, fingers fumbling over the handle, blood from his wounds staining the water around him. The shark held firm, pulling him deeper with each second that passed. He could feel the weight of it, its presence haunting him with every beat of his heart. _No. Till, I can't die like this. The thought pulsed through his mind, frantic and desperate. His hand finally found the spear gun, and he aimed it blindly toward the shadowy mass of the shark below him. But his vision was clouded with both panic and the sharp pain from his leg, and the weapon felt awkward in his trembling grasp. He couldn't afford to miss. He couldn't afford to lose his only means of defense. "Carlos," Mark tried to shout through the regulator, but the words came out as a garbled sound, muffled by the thick mask. His breath came fast and shallow, a steady stream of bubbles rushing past his face. The shark pulled away, momentarily loosening its grip. Mark felt the sting of his torn flesh as he kicked harder, trying to break free, but the shark didn't retreat. It circled, circling just out of reach, its movements fluid and deadly. Think. Mark's mind raced, the fear and confusion clouding his ability to focus. The shark wasn't gone, it was waiting for him to make a mistake. Carlos's voice crackled through his radio again, sharp and urgent. "Mark, come back now. Do not fight it. Swim to the group." But he was too late. The shark had made up its mind. Mark's body jerked again as the shark lunged for him, its body an unstoppable force, like a shadow rising from the deep. He barely had time to react. He raised the spear gun, aiming at the massive predator, and fired. The spear shot forward, but the shark veered at the last moment. The bolt missed by inches, grazing the shark's side before disappearing into the blue. The predator paused, just for a moment, its dark eyes flicking toward Mark before it began to move again. Faster this time. Mark could hear his own breath, rasping through the regulator as he kicked desperately. His vision was beginning to fade, the pain from his leg becoming unbearable. Blood poured from the wound, creating a crimson trail in the water. He could feel the weight of it, dragging him down as the water turned colder and darker. Keep moving. Keep moving. He forced himself to swim, pulling himself away from the drop-off and toward the shallows, toward safety. But the shark was right behind him. He could feel the tension, the predator's presence just below him. Every stroke was an eternity, each movement feeling like it could be his last. Suddenly, a sharp pain exploded in his arm. Mark screamed, his mouth flooding with water as the shark closed in again. The force of its bite was brutal, and this time it was his arm that was in its grip. The pressure was almost too much to bear. He could feel the bones in his arm cracking under the force, the blood flowing from the torn flesh. The water around him turned darker, and the pain became too much to withstand. Mark kicked harder, using every last ounce of his strength, but the shark wasn't done. It was playing with him now, toying with its prey. The fear that had been gnawing at him turned into pure, unadulterated terror. This is it. This is how I die. The thought was a cold weight in his chest, his strength fading with every passing second. But then, something changed. Carlos. A flash of movement through the water. Mark's fading vision caught a figure coming toward him. Carlos. He saw the guide's spear gun, raised and aimed, a shot that was coming too late, but it was coming. The shark hesitated. For a moment, Mark thought it would strike again, that this time it would finish him off. But the appearance of the guide had shifted the balance. The shark swam in a wide arc around the two men, its body coiling with predatory patience. Carlos's voice came through the radio again, calm but full of authority. "Stay still, Mark. Don't move." Mark's head spun. The weight of everything was pulling him down. His vision was beginning to tunnel, the edges of the ocean growing darker. But somehow he held on. He fought to stay conscious, trying to hold onto the hope that Carlos would save him. The next few moments felt like a blur. Carlos was in front of him now, spear gun raised and aimed directly at the shark, which hovered in place, waiting. Carlos fired. The spear shot through the water with a hiss, and the impact was immediate. The shark recoiled, a brief moment of confusion passing through its eyes. The spear had struck its side, embedding itself deep into the muscle, and the shark let out a sudden, no growl, a guttural, animalistic sound that reverberated through the water. It was no longer toying with them. It was angered. The shark surged forward in a final, violent lunge, but Carlos was ready. He dove forward with the precision of a trained predator, aiming his spear gun again. He fired once more, the spear catching the shark's snout, forcing it back. The shark hesitated, its blood now mingling with Mark's as the two combatants swirled through the water. The struggle was brutal, but the shark had tasted blood. It had no intention of retreating, but the guide's experience held true. With a final, calculated movement, Carlos positioned himself between Mark and the shark, the spear gun raised like a shield. The shark, seeing its moment gone, retreated into the depths. It disappeared as suddenly as it had come. Carlos grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the surface. "Stay with me, Mark. You're gonna be okay. I've got you," Carlos said through the regulator, his voice calm but urgent. Mark felt himself dragged upward, the world spinning around him as he fought to stay conscious. The pain in his leg and arm was all-consuming, but Carlos's words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. Finally, the surface. Carlos dragged him to the boat, his hand on Mark's shoulder as the crew hauled him aboard. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body, but it was nothing compared to the relief he felt to be out of the water, to be away from the predator that had nearly killed him. "Stay with me, Mark," Carlos repeated as they worked quickly to stop the bleeding, applying pressure to the wounds. Mark tried to focus, tried to make sense of what had just happened, but his mind was foggy. The pain, the terror, the shark. "Just breathe, Mark. You're going to be okay," Carlos said. But Mark wasn't so sure. His heart was still pounding, his breaths ragged and shallow. The sea had nearly claimed him, and as the boat cut its way back toward the shore, he knew one thing for certain. He would never look at the ocean the same way again. Mark's world had shrunk to a single sensation, the overwhelming, aching pain that radiated from his leg and arm. Every breath he took seemed to rip through his chest as he clung to the side of the boat, his body numb and tingling from the shock. He didn't know how much time had passed since Carlos had dragged him from the water, but the whole scene played out in his mind like a nightmare. The boat rocked gently, but the movement only made his wounds throb harder, as if the sea itself were punishing him for his near-fatal mistake. His vision swam in and out of focus, the salt water burning his eyes, the harsh reality of what had just happened sinking in. The shark was still out there. "Stay with me, Mark. We're almost there," Carlos said, his voice unwavering, though Mark could hear the strain in his tone. He had been applying pressure to the deep gashes on Mark's thigh, trying to stop the bleeding, but the blood had soaked through the makeshift bandages. Carlos's hands were slick with it, and his eyes darted around, scanning the horizon for any sign of the dive boat that would meet them. Mark wanted to respond, to assure Carlos that he was still with him, but his words came out as a strangled gasp, barely audible beneath the waves. The pain was too much, and the cold grip of terror was still with him, settling deep in his gut. He tried to remember the exact moments before the shark had attacked. The dark shape beneath him circling slowly, the jolt of the initial bite, the shock of the pain, the desperate thrashing as he fought to escape. He couldn't remember exactly what had happened after that, only the overwhelming sensation of being helpless in the water. The wound on his leg, the one where the shark had clamped down with its powerful jaws, throbbed unbearably. He could feel the blood continuing to seep out, the crimson staining the water, and he knew, somewhere deep inside, that he was losing more than he could afford. But there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could focus on was the sound of Carlos's voice and the rhythmic hum of the engine as the boat cut through the waves. "I'll radio ahead," Carlos said. His brow furrowed as he pulled out a small waterproof radio from his dive vest. His fingers were shaking, but he handled the device with practiced ease. "Mayday, mayday." Carlos's voice crackled through the static as he spoke into the radio. "This is _Azul Profundo _. We have a diver with severe injuries. Bull shark attack. We need immediate medical assistance. Repeat, Bull shark attack. Injuries to the leg and arm. Azo. There was a long pause. Then a voice responded on the other end. Tinny but clear. Copy that _azul profundo _. We've notified the maritime authorities. They're on their way. ETA 20 minutes. Do you have a visual on your location? Carlos glanced at the GPS screen on the boat's console. We're at coordinates 457683, just past the reef. Injuries are critical. The patient is losing blood fast. Another pause. Mark could hear the faint hum of the radio in the background, but it sounded like static. His mind too clouded with pain and confusion to focus on the conversation. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he felt a nauseating dizziness settling in. Mark, Carlos said, crouching down beside him. He tried to keep his voice steady, but Mark could hear the tension in his words. You have to stay with me. We're getting help, but you need to stay awake. Just stay with me. Mark nodded weakly, though every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his body. His vision blurred again, and he felt himself slip, his mind drifting in and out like the waves around them. Carlos. Mark tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. It was so fast. I know, Carlos replied, his voice low, almost soothing despite the urgency of the situation. It happened fast, but you're here. You're alive. We're getting you back to shore. The boat cut through the waves, each movement a stark reminder of Mark's fragile state. He clung to consciousness like a lifeline, but the pain in his leg and arm was too intense, too consuming. He couldn't focus on anything else. His body felt heavy, as though every ounce of strength had been drained from him. Carlos worked in silence beside him, his hands methodical as he applied pressure to the wounds, trying to staunch the bleeding as best as he could. Mark heard him mutter something in Spanish, his words too low to catch. The words didn't matter, though. They didn't change the situation. And then, through the haze of pain, Mark heard the sound he'd been waiting for. The distant hum of another boat. The maritime police were here. The boat pulled alongside them, its sleek, white hull cutting through the water. A team of 2 officers, both clad in wetsuits, quickly boarded the _azul profundo _. They were a blur of motion, taking in the situation as they worked with efficiency. One of the officers, a woman with short, dark hair, immediately assessed Mark's injuries. Severe blood loss, she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. We need to get him to the clinic now. She glanced at Carlos. What's his status? Conscious. For now, Carlos replied. But he's losing a lot of blood. The shark, he stopped himself, clearly unwilling to go into further detail. He needs immediate treatment. We've got it from here, the woman said. We'll stabilize him on the way to the dock. You did good, guiding him to safety. Carlos didn't answer, his face grim as he nodded. He moved out of the way, letting the officers take control, but Mark saw the look on his face: worry, guilt, and a touch of fear. The second officer, a tall man with a weathered face, worked quickly, setting up an 4-drip to replace some of Mark's lost fluids. Mark barely registered the needle as it slid into his arm. The officer was efficient, but Mark felt detached from it all, floating in a haze of exhaustion and pain. Just hang on, man, the officer said, his voice soft but firm. We'll get you out of here. Mark's vision swam. He wanted to respond, to thank them, but the words wouldn't come. His body was shutting down. The coldness from the shock was creeping into his lungs, and the world around him felt as though it were slowly slipping away. As the boat sped toward the shore, Mark's mind wandered. He thought of the shark, the cold, calculated predator that had nearly taken his life. He couldn't shake the image of its eyes, those dark, empty eyes that had locked onto him with terrifying precision. The water had been clear, too clear, as if the shark had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when it did, it was too fast, too strong for him to do anything about it. The fear, the raw terror that had gripped him in the water was something he would never forget. He had always known that sharks were apex predators, but standing in their domain, helpless, was an experience that changed everything. Carlos's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're going to make it, Mark. We're almost there." But Mark wasn't sure. His body felt too weak, too broken. The sea had tested him, and it had nearly won. And as the boat raced toward the shore, he realized that he would never be the same again. The dock came into view, and with it, the promise of safety. But for Mark, the battle was far from over. The sound of the boat's engine hummed steadily in the background, a constant reminder that they were moving fast. Mark's body felt heavy, almost unresponsive as the officers worked frantically around him. His breath was shallow, strained, the cold ocean air filling his lungs but not giving him any relief. Blood continued to seep from the deep gashes in his leg and arm, leaving red streaks across the surface of the water that he could barely focus on. Carlos stood beside him, his face drawn and pale, his hands shaking as he hovered uncertainly, watching the officers work. "You're going to be okay, Mark," Carlos said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was a reassurance for himself as much as it was for Mark. Mark nodded weakly, his chest tightening with every labored breath. He wanted to speak, to tell Carlos that he was scared, that he didn't know if he could make it, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was too much. His body felt as if it were fading, slowly, inch by inch, until nothing was left but the buzzing hum in his ears. The woman officer, a calm, focused presence, kept her hands busy, adjusting the 4-line in his arm and checking his vitals. "His blood pressure is low, but he's still conscious," she muttered to her partner, a man with a weathered face and dark eyes, who was checking the boat's position. "Keep him steady," the man replied. "We need to move faster. The sooner we get him to a hospital, the better. The wound on his leg's deep, and I'm not sure if he's going to hold up much longer." Mark wanted to speak, to ask them how much time he had, but all he could manage was a soft, involuntary groan as the boat hit a wave, sending a jolt of pain through his body. His leg throbbed with every movement, a constant reminder of the brutal force of the shark's jaws. He could still feel the pressure, the way it had sunk into his flesh like a vice, the memory of the shark's powers still reverberating in his mind. "Keep pressure on the leg wound," the woman officer said, her voice snapping Mark back to the present. "We don't want him losing any more blood." "I've got it," Carlos said, his hands trembling as he pressed down harder on the makeshift bandages. His voice was low, shaky. "I'm not going to let you go, Mark." Mark blinked, his vision dimming. He was losing track of time. The sounds of the boat's engine, the splashing of the water against the hull, the urgent commands of the officers, all of it felt distant, as though he were drifting in and out of reality. His limbs were numb, his mind foggy. "Mark, you have to stay with us?" the man officer said, snapping his fingers in front of Mark's face to get his attention. "Stay with us, buddy." Mark's head was swimming. He tried to focus, to keep his eyes open, but his body seemed to resist. He felt the pull of darkness, like a tide that wanted to drag him under. The pain was there, sharp and immediate, but it was fading too. Fading into a distant, almost numb throb. Carlos's voice, strained and desperate, broke through. "Come on, Mark. Don't you dare do this now." Mark wanted to respond, to say something to ease the tension, but his throat was dry. His lips parted in a feeble attempt to speak, but no sound came. He wasn't sure if he was hallucinating, or if the dizziness was just the blood loss taking its toll. Everything seemed to blur, like the world was fading out of focus, the edges of his vision darkening. The man officer glanced at the woman. "We're not going to make it to the hospital. We need to get him to the dock. Now." Carlos's face went pale at the words. "What do you mean? You said we were almost there. We're so close." The woman officer's face was grim. "We're pushing his limits. We need to get him out of the boat and into medical care fast. I don't think he's going to make it much longer if we don't move quicker." Mark heard the words, felt the weight of them, but they barely registered. His body felt like a weightless thing, adrift in the current of pain and exhaustion. The terror of the shark's attack was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of his fading consciousness. But it was harder to remember the details now. The only thing that was real was the suffocating grip of his injuries. The boat cut through the water with increasing speed, the shoreline now visible in the distance, the white foam of the waves churning beneath them. The officers worked together like a well-oiled machine, each of them performing their duties with quiet efficiency. But Mark could sense the growing urgency in their movements, the tension that was building in their voices. The woman officer checked her watch and cursed softly. "We're running out of time." He was going into shock. Carlos's eyes widened in fear. "What does that mean? What do I need to do?" The woman officer didn't answer immediately. She was focused on Mark, adjusting his position on the boat to keep his body as stable as possible. "Keep him warm. Don't let him get too cold. His body's not responding like it should." I don't know what to do," Carlos said, his voice breaking. I should have kept him with the group." "You did the best you could," the man officer said, cutting him off. He placed a hand on Carlos's shoulder. "We're doing everything we can. He's fighting, and that's what matters." Mark could hear their voices, but it was as though they were coming from far away. His chest constricted, his breath coming faster, ragged, as his body continued to slip into the dark. His fingers twitched, his body fighting against the overwhelming fatigue. But every movement felt like it took everything from him. The pain in his leg was a distant thing now, a throb that pulsed with each heartbeat, and he found that he couldn't focus on anything else. "Hold on, Mark," Carlos whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just a little longer. We're almost there." Mark's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, his gaze meeting Carlos's. The concern in the guide's eyes was unmistakable, and in that brief moment, Mark felt a fleeting sense of comfort. He could feel the tension in Carlos's hands as they pressed against his leg, trying to stem the flow of blood, trying to do everything he could to save him. And then the boat lurched to a halt, and Mark was pulled from the moment. The jarring movement sent a shock through his body, waking him from the stupor he had been sinking into. His eyes snapped open as the boat slid up onto the dock. "We're here," the woman officer said, her voice a little more urgent now. "Get him out. Get him onto the stretcher." Carlos moved quickly, though he was visibly shaken. "I'm right here, Mark," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "You're going to make it. We're here." The officers moved with efficiency, lifting Mark carefully onto the stretcher, their hands steady despite the panic that hung thick in the air. Mark's world was spinning again, the voices around him muffled and distant. He tried to focus, tried to hold on, but everything was slipping. As they wheeled him off the boat and onto the dock, Mark's mind began to clear for just a moment. He thought he saw a group of paramedics waiting for them, their bright uniforms flashing in the sun. He heard the clatter of medical equipment and the distant sound of voices calling out, but he couldn't make sense of it all. He couldn't feel his legs anymore, and his arms were numb. He had survived the shark's attack, but now, as he was rushed toward the hospital, he felt like he was slipping away from life itself, his body weak, blood lost, strength fading. But as the team of medical personnel surrounded him, as they began their rapid assessments and treatments, Mark's fading mind held onto one thing. I'm still here. I'm still alive. For now. The sterile white walls of the hospital seemed to close in on Mark Sullivan as he regained consciousness. His eyelids fluttered open, a harsh light assaulting his senses. It took a moment for his eyes to focus, the world around him swimming in and out of clarity. He blinked several times, the sharp sting of his injuries bringing him back to reality. The first thing he felt was the ache and unrelenting, gnawing pain in his leg, in his arm, and deep in his chest. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, too dry to form words. His body felt heavy, immobile, as though it were no longer his own. A beeping sound filled the room, rhythmic and insistent, as if a machine were measuring the seconds of his life. His vision slowly cleared, and he saw white sheets covering him, his limbs restrained by intravenous lines and bandages. The world smelled sterile like antiseptic and faintly of rubber, and yet all he could focus on was the dull ache that seemed to reverberate through every nerve in his body. A soft voice reached his ears. "Mark? Mark? Can you hear me?" He turned his head slightly, the motion dizzying, but he saw a figure standing at his bedside. It was Carlos, the dive guide. Mark blinked again, trying to process the situation. "Carlos," Mark rasped, his voice cracked and raw. Carlos's face was pale, his eyes bloodshot as though he hadn't slept in days. He was standing at the side of the bed, his hand resting gently on Mark's arm, as though trying to offer some comfort. His jaw was clenched tight, the muscles working with frustration and guilt. "Mark, you're awake." "Thank God," Carlos said, his voice thick with relief. "You're in Cozumel Hospital. You're safe now." Mark tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry as sandpaper, his mouth tasting foul. His eyes moved down toward his leg, which was wrapped tightly in bandages, a splint sticking out at an odd angle. His other arm was similarly bound, with deep sutures visible along the skin. The overwhelming image of the shark's attack, the jaws sinking into his flesh, flashed in his mind, and his pulse quickened. The panic surged through him before he could stop it, and his chest tightened as his heart began to race. He opened his mouth to say something, but it was as though the words had vanished entirely. His body felt foreign, disconnected from his mind. Carlos seemed to catch on, his hand gently pressing against Mark's good arm. "Take it easy, man. Breathe. Okay? The doctor's coming. Just relax." Mark tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt thin, strained. His lungs felt as though they were suffocating under the weight of the fear pressing in on him. He could still feel the phantom pain of the shark's bite, the overwhelming force of its jaws, and the cold emptiness of the water as he drifted toward the darkness. He was no longer in that deep ocean. He was here in this bed, alive, but he didn't feel like it. He felt like he was still underwater, struggling to surface. It wasn't long before a doctor entered the room, a tall, well-built man in a white coat. His face was kind but serious, and he walked to Mark's side with practiced ease, checking his vital signs and adjusting the drip. "How are you feeling, Mr. Sullivan?" the doctor asked, his voice smooth and calming. Mark wanted to answer, but the words still wouldn't come. He felt disconnected, trapped in his own body, his mind too foggy to form coherent thoughts. He looked up at Carlos, whose face was filled with a mix of exhaustion and concern. "The pain, it's overwhelming," Mark managed to say, his voice breaking. His hand instinctively moved toward his leg, but he winced at the thought of even touching the injury. The doctor nodded. "You were lucky to survive, Mr. Sullivan. Bull sharks are one of the most aggressive species, and you were very fortunate that we were able to stabilize you. You've suffered significant blood loss, but we've managed to stop the worst of it." Carlos squeezed Mark's shoulder, his face showing visible relief. That's good to hear." Mark blinked, the edges of his world still unfocused. He wanted to ask how long he'd been unconscious, what had happened after the shark attack, but the words felt too heavy, too distant. He could barely keep his eyes open. His body felt as though it were fighting against him, urging him to drift back into the black void. I remember." Mark struggled, his breath ragged, his heart beating too fast. "The shark, it was so fast." The doctor tilted his head slightly, his eyes softening. "Yes, I know. The bite was severe, but we've stitched you up. The leg wound is the worst, but it looks like it'll heal with time, though you'll need physical therapy. You're going to need rest. A lot of it." Mark let his head fall back against the pillow, his eyes fluttering closed again. He wanted to close the door on the memory of the shark, to shut out the suffocating terror that had almost consumed him. But it was there, in the back of his mind, replaying over and over the predator's unblinking eyes, The crushing grip of its jaws, the helplessness. His chest tightened again at the thought. Carlos must have seen the shift in his expression. He leaned forward, his voice quieter. "Mark, I know this is hard, but you've got to hang in there. You're going to get through this." Mark opened his eyes again, forcing himself to look at Carlos, at the man who had pulled him from the water, who had fought for his life just as hard as he had fought for his own. I can't stop thinking about it. The shark, its teeth." His voice trailed off, the words choking him. "I was helpless." Carlos's eyes softened, and he sat down at the side of the bed, his hand on Mark's arm, grounding him. "You weren't helpless. You did everything you could. You fight. We all fight, man. And you survived. You're alive." Mark's thoughts drifted again, his body exhausted from the effort of staying present. Carlos's words felt like a distant echo, but somewhere deep down, Mark knew Carlos was right. He had fought. He had survived. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Mark had no real concept of time anymore. His injuries were excruciating, but the pain seemed distant now, almost muted by the fog that had settled over his mind. Every time he drifted off to sleep, he was pulled back by the beeping of the heart monitor, the sounds of footsteps outside the room, the soft murmur of doctors speaking to each other in the hall. Carlos never left his side, always there when Mark opened his eyes, his presence a constant reassurance. The days seemed to blend together. Mark couldn't distinguish one from the other. He slept, he woke, he felt the relentless sting of the wounds in his leg and arm, the tightness in his chest when he thought of the attack. He tried to push it away, to focus on something, anything else, but the memory wouldn't leave him. It wasn't just the physical pain that haunted him, it was the fear of the ocean, the fear of the shark, and the fear that it might happen again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital room, Mark stirred from his restless sleep. He heard voices outside, muffled but familiar. He turned his head slowly, fighting the heaviness in his eyelids. Carlos was standing near the door, talking to a man in a uniform, a police officer. Mark could barely make out the words, but he caught the mention of shark attack and official report. He was suddenly aware that the whole ordeal, his ordeal, was being documented, filed away like some statistic, some tragic event to be added to the list. His heart raced, and a sinking feeling spread in his chest. Was that all he was now? Just another shark attack survivor? Another victim? He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him, a reminder of how fragile life truly was. Carlos turned toward the bed and saw that Mark was awake. He excused himself from the officer and walked over, sitting beside him. "You doing okay?" Carlos asked quietly, his voice tinged with concern. Mark nodded weakly. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what happened." Carlos placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know, but the important thing is you made it. You survived." Mark blinked, the weight of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He hadn't just survived the attack, he had survived the terror, the drowning fear that came with being at the mercy of something that wanted him dead. But that wasn't all. He had to move forward. He had no choice. "I'm scared," Mark admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know if I can go back into the water." Carlos looked at him for a long moment, his eyes soft. "You don't have to, Mark. You'll decide when you're ready. And when you are, you'll know. You're stronger than you think." Mark's eyes filled with tears, the emotions he had tried to hold back breaking through the cracks. He didn't know if he would ever go back into the ocean. But right now, he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about surviving, about healing, and about the fight he had ahead. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice hoarse. Carlos nodded, his face serious but gentle. "We're in this together, man. You don't have to do this alone." And for the first time since the attack, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't alone in this. Maybe, with time, he would find his way back. The days blurred together in a haze of hospital sheets, painkillers, and the quiet hum of medical machines. Mark Sullivan had gone from a near-death experience to a recovery filled with uncertainty. He had survived the shark attack, but it felt as if his body was still trapped in the depths of the ocean, unable to breathe fully, unable to escape the constant weight of fear. The attack was a memory that haunted his every waking moment. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the shark's cold, predatory eyes staring at him from below, its jaws sinking into his leg, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The suffocating terror of that moment was still fresh in his mind, a visceral reminder of how close he had come to losing his life. Mark had been discharged from the hospital just a few days earlier, though he still wore the bandages on his leg and arm. He had been told that recovery would be slow weeks of rest and physical therapy, the promise of months before he would be able to dive again, if ever. The wounds would heal, but the scars, both physical and psychological, would remain. His mind often wandered to the shark. Carlos had told him that the predator had likely been a bull shark, a species known for its territorial nature and its predatory aggression. Mark had asked the doctors about the shark's behavior, about what had caused the attack, but their answers only brought more questions. They spoke of the shark's territorial instincts, of its movements in the area around the reef, but none of them could explain why it had attacked him. Was it hunger? Was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or had something about him triggered the shark's aggression? The more Mark thought about it, the more questions there were. He was a diver, and he knew the risks that came with exploring the ocean's depths. But none of his experiences, none of the training he had undergone, had prepared him for the reality of being at the mercy of a predator like that. The shark had been a natural force, efficient, unyielding, and, in its own way, almost indifferent to the suffering it had caused. It was this thought that kept Mark awake at night, the idea that the shark had simply been doing what sharks do. It wasn't a monster, it wasn't some supernatural entity, it was a predator, behaving in the way nature had designed it to. But that didn't make it any easier to live with. It didn't erase the terror of that moment, or the fear that, perhaps, the shark was still out there, waiting. It was a week after Mark's discharge when he received a call from Carlos. The sound of the phone ringing was enough to make Mark's heart skip a beat. He wasn't sure why he had never deleted Carlos's number. Perhaps it was some strange form of hope that things would go back to normal, that he would heal and go back to diving. But now, as he held the phone to his ear, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety. "Mark," Carlos said, his voice hoarse but urgent. "I need to talk to you. You have to come to the marina. Is everything okay?" Mark asked, sitting up in bed. His leg was propped up with pillows, and he winced as he shifted. "I don't know. Something's wrong, man. There's something we need to figure out. Just meet me here, please." Carlos's tone was unsettlingly serious, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Mark couldn't put his finger on it, but it made his heart race. He agreed to meet him, grabbing his crutches and making his way to the marina with a sense of dread gnawing at his insides. When Mark arrived at the marina, Carlos was standing at the end of the dock, his back to the water. He was staring out into the horizon, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. "Carlos," Mark called out as he approached. Carlos turned to face him, his eyes dark, the bags under his eyes more pronounced than they had been before. It was clear that he hadn't slept well. Mark's stomach tightened as he took in the sight of his friend. But before he could ask what was going on, Carlos spoke. "You know that bull shark that attacked you?" Carlos asked, his voice low, barely audible over the sound of the waves. Mark nodded, shivering despite the warm air. "What about it?" Carlos hesitated, his jaw clenching as he looked out over the water. "It's still here." Mark's eyes widened. He thought he had misheard. He stepped forward, bracing himself on the crutches. "What do you mean it's still here?" Carlos turned to him, his face pale. "I mean the shark that's been spotted in the area, just off the same reef." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The idea that the same shark that had attacked him was still lingering in the waters was almost too much to bear. He tried to steady himself, his crutches digging into the wooden dock beneath him. "That's impossible," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Sharks don't stick around in one place for long, do they? They migrate." Carlos shook his head. "Not always. Not if it's a territorial shark. This one's been spotted several times in the past few days. It's been circling the area, and from what I've heard, it's not leaving." Mark felt a cold chill spread through him, his mind racing as the implications of Carlos's words hit him. "You mean to say, it's still hunting? Is still active?" Carlos nodded grimly. "Yes, the divers in the area have reported sightings. It's been moving in and out of the shallows. It's behaving like it's claiming that part of the reef." Mark's stomach turned at the thought. It wasn't just a random attack anymore. The shark wasn't just an animal acting on instinct, it was a creature that had marked that spot as its domain. Mark's mind flashed back to the fear he had felt during the attack. And now, the thought that it could be out there, waiting, made his heart race. Carlos took a deep breath. "I called the authorities. They've been trying to track it. But the waters here are tricky. The visibility's bad, and it's hard to get a good look at it from the boats. But I think the thing that makes it worse is that the locals are getting nervous. Some of them are talking about closing off the reef entirely." Mark clenched his jaw, his thoughts spinning. But what does that mean for the diving community? What about the tourists? It's a major spot for divers. Carlos nodded, his eyes filled with concern. "That's exactly what I'm worried about. The authorities have issued warnings, but there's a lot of pressure from local businesses to keep the area open. They want the tourism revenue. People don't want to acknowledge that this shark is still out there. They want to believe it's just a freak occurrence." Mark felt a growing sense of unease, his mind racing. "But you said it's territorial, right? So, is there a chance it'll come back after me?" Carlos looked at him with a mixture of guilt and concern. "I don't know, man. I can't say for sure. But I've never seen a shark act like this. It's like it's become more aggressive since it attacked you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Mark could feel his stomach tighten, but he tried to push past the fear. He had survived the attack. He had made it through the worst of it. But the idea that the shark was still out there, that it had claimed that part of the reef as its territory, was almost too much to bear. "I don't know what to do," Mark said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What do I do now, Carlos?" Carlos looked at him, his eyes softening. "I don't know either, but whatever you decide, I'll be there to help. You're not alone in this." Mark took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that he couldn't live in fear, that he couldn't let the shark control his life. But the thought of facing that same predator again, it felt impossible. How could he ever go back into those waters, knowing what waited beneath the surface? But then, as if on cue, the sound of an engine broke the silence. A small boat sped past the marina, the figures on board waving their hands frantically. Mark looked at Carlos. "What's going on?" Carlos's face hardened. "That's what I'm afraid of. They're out there, looking for the shark. They think it's still there, and they're not waiting for the authorities anymore." Mark's pulse quickened. He didn't know if he was ready to face it again. But one thing was clear. The shark wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a living, breathing reality, and it was still out there, watching, waiting. "Come on," Carlos said. "Let's go see what's happening." The two of them moved down the dock toward the boat, the weight of the decision still pressing heavily on Mark's chest. The ocean had already taken so much from him. But now, as they approached the boat, he knew that it was time for him to make a choice. Either he would face the shark again, or he would let the fear control him forever. And deep down, Mark knew that if he didn't face the terror now, it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The coastal air in Cozumel felt different now, more oppressive somehow. The salty breeze, once invigorating, now carried a sense of dread. Mark had been home for nearly 2 weeks, still trapped in a limbo between the terror of the shark attack and the painful process of recovery. His leg was slowly healing, the stitches still fresh beneath the bandages. The pain had dulled with time, but the psychological scars were far more complex. Every ripple in the water, every deep blue expanse of the ocean, reminded him of the shark of the terror he had felt. He couldn't escape it, but today was different. The authorities had asked him to meet with them, along with the rest of the dive crew, to give a statement about the incident. They had already spoken to Carlos, the other divers, and the witnesses. They had already seen the footage from the dive boat's camera, and they knew the basics. But they needed to hear from Mark. They needed to understand what had happened from the perspective of the victim, the one who had been in the water when the shark had attacked. Mark sat in a small, sterile office at the Cozumel Maritime Police Station. The walls were bare except for a few maps of local dive sites and regulations. There was a small window that looked out toward the ocean, but Mark couldn't bring himself to look. The thought of the vast waters stretching out there, as if hiding something waiting to devour him, made his stomach churn. He gripped the chair's arms tightly, willing himself not to look toward the window. Carlos had insisted on accompanying him, and Mark was grateful. His presence was a thin thread of reassurance in the suffocating room. Carlos had been a constant during his recovery, visiting him daily, checking in on him, and trying to offer some semblance of normalcy to a life that now felt unrecognizable. Carlos had always been there when Mark needed him, and today was no different. "Hang," Carlos said, his voice low but firm, leaning in close to Mark as they waited. "I know you're nervous about this, but you've got to get through it. They need your side of the story. You've got this." Mark nodded, his fingers still gripping the armrests. His eyes remained fixed on the table in front of him, the white surface almost too bright in the starkly lit room. He couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life, everything he had worked for and dreamed of, was slipping through his fingers. "You'll be okay," Carlos said again. He placed a hand on Mark's shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "They're not out to blame you, you know? They just need the facts. Just tell them what happened. Keep it simple." Mark looked up at his friend. "I'm not sure what to say," he replied, his voice hoarse. "It all happened so fast. I don't even remember some parts of it. I don't know." Carlos gave him a firm nod. "You don't need to know everything. You don't need to remember every single detail. Just give them what you can. That's all anyone expects." Just then, the door to the office creaked open, and two officers entered. One was a man in his 40s, stocky and no-nonsense, his face lined with experience. The other was a woman in her 30s, calm and methodical, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. They both wore official uniforms, the insignia of the Cozumel Maritime Police visible on their shoulders. The man, whose name was Lieutenant Reyes, gestured toward the chair across from Mark. "Mr. Sullivan," Reyes said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Thank you for coming in today. We know this isn't easy, but it's important that we get a complete picture of what happened during the attack. You're under no obligation to share anything you don't want to, but your statement will help us with our investigation." Mark swallowed hard. The weight of the situation, the responsibility to speak about what had happened, felt like an anchor pulling him down. He glanced at Carlos, who nodded at him reassuringly. Mark's mouth felt dry, and he took a deep breath before he finally spoke. "I'll do my best," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly. He looked at the officers, then back down at his hands. "I don't remember everything perfectly, but I'll tell you what I can." Lieutenant Reyes nodded, motioning for him to continue. "Start at the beginning. What do you remember about the dive? Anything unusual before the attack?" Mark's mind immediately went back to the moment he had first stepped into the water. It had felt like just another day, another dive. The excitement, the anticipation, the beauty of the underwater world waiting to be explored. But everything had changed in an instant. "I remember everything before the attack," Mark began, his voice steadying slightly as he spoke. "Carlos briefed us on the dive. He told us about the boundaries and the risk of sharks, but honestly, I thought I knew the waters better than that. I've dived in the Caribbean before. I thought I was experienced enough to know what to do." He paused, looking up at Carlos, who gave him a small, understanding nod. "Go on," the woman officer prompted, her voice gentle. "What happened next?" I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deeper I could explore," Mark continued. "I'm not saying I ignored Carlos, but I wandered off. It was, I don't know, I just wanted to see the untouched part of the reef. The farther out we went, the more I felt like I was pushing the limits." Mark shook his head. "Carlos warned me, and I didn't listen. That's on me." Lieutenant Reyes's eyes softened slightly, but his tone was firm. "What happened when you went beyond the designated boundaries?" Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. The memory was still so vivid, the terror still so raw. "I saw something move in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it got closer. It was a shark. It wasn't aggressive at first. It circled beneath me, and I froze. I didn't know if I should move or stay still, but I didn't want to panic. I should have gone back, but I didn't. I kept drifting further." Carlos leaned forward slightly. "Mark, I saw you drift away. I signaled to you to come back, but it was too late. You were already too deep. By the time I realized what was happening, I saw the blood in the water." Mark closed his eyes at the memory. The image of the shark rising from the depths, its sleek body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. It just attacked. I don't know what triggered it. I didn't even have time to think. The next thing I knew, I felt the pressure on my leg. It was like being trapped in a vice. I screamed, but it only made things worse. The woman officer jotted down notes, her expression hard to read. "And after the shark released you, what did you do?" "I kicked and I kicked. I swam back toward the boat, but the shark came back. It was circling, watching me like it was waiting for me to make another move." Mark's voice faltered for a moment, and he looked down at his hands. It was like it was playing with me. I just kept thinking that I wasn't going to make it. I couldn't move fast enough. Carlos's voice broke into the silence. I remember it clearly. I dove back in with a spear gun. The shark got closer, but I managed to draw its attention long enough for Mark to make it back to the boat. Reyes's eyes narrowed. "And when the shark attacked again, you were able to drive it off?" Carlos nodded grimly. "Yes, we got Mark to the boat, but it wasn't easy. We had to be quick." That's when I saw the blood in the water and realized how badly Mark had been hurt. Mark swallowed hard, the weight of the events crashing down on him again. "I don't remember much after that. I just remember being pulled onto the boat. My leg was in so much pain, and I couldn't keep my eyes open." The woman officer leaned in slightly, her gaze softening. "And when the authorities arrived, what did you hear? Were you aware of what was happening?" Mark nodded, his voice strained. "I heard the paramedics. I heard them talking about stabilizing me. I remember hearing Carlos on the radio with the maritime police. I don't remember everything, but I remember the urgency in his voice." Carlos's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "I thought I was going to lose you, Mark. I've seen sharks before, but this was different." The shark kept circling, like it knew exactly where to find us. Reyes scribbled down a few notes before looking up at Mark. "We've been tracking the bull shark activity near that reef. It's uncommon for a shark to behave this aggressively, but it's been spotted in the area more than once. We believe it's claimed that part of the reef as its territory." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "It's still out there?" The woman officer's expression was grim. "Yes, our team has been monitoring the area, but the shark has remained elusive. We're working with local businesses to implement new safety protocols. But this is a serious situation." Carlos leaned back in his chair. "What happens now?" Reyes looked at both of them, his gaze steady. "We're making a formal record of this incident. We'll take everything into account: your statements, the footage from the dive boat, the reports from other divers. The shark's behavior is something we're still analyzing. But for now, we'll focus on improving safety measures in the area." Mark felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. There was no more uncertainty now. The shark's attack had been recorded, the official report would be filed, and he could move forward, at least in some way. He looked at Carlos, who gave him a silent nod of support. "You did the right thing," Carlos said softly. "You did what you could." Mark took a deep breath, his mind settling slightly, though the weight of the ordeal would stay with him. He knew the ocean would always be part of him, that the fear and the terror would never fully go away. But at least now the truth had been spoken, and that was a step toward healing. The officer stood, signaling the end of the interview. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Sullivan. We'll be in touch if anything else comes up. Stay safe, both of you." As they left, Mark turned to Carlos. "You think I'll ever go back in the water?" Carlos smiled, though it was a small, weary smile. "I don't know, man, but when you're ready, we'll go together." Mark nodded. He wasn't sure when that day would come, but somehow, the thought of diving again didn't seem as impossible as it had before. One day at a time, that's all he could focus on now. The morning sun poured into Mark's small apartment in Cozumel, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the window, but his gaze was unfocused, lost in the vastness of his own thoughts. His leg was propped up on a stack of pillows, still wrapped in bandages. The wound from the shark attack now a reminder of the violence the ocean had shown him. The memory of the shark's jaws, the force of its bite, and the overwhelming terror he had felt in those moments played in his mind like a broken record. It had been nearly a month since the attack, but Mark still couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that lingered like a shadow over his every move. The physical pain had subsided, but the mental scars were far harder to heal. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shark, the glint of its eyes, the sharp teeth that had sunk into his flesh, the crushing power of its bite. Even now, sitting in his apartment, the silence felt like a ticking clock, a countdown to the next moment of terror. He looked at the small coffee table next to him, where a half-empty mug of coffee sat, forgotten. His body still hadn't fully adjusted to the recovery process. His leg ached with every movement, and his arm, though healing, felt weak and stiff. The doctor had told him that his wounds would heal with time, but that didn't mean the road to recovery would be easy. He had physical therapy scheduled for the coming weeks, but that was only the beginning. The real challenge was the mental healing, the terror that gripped his chest every time he thought about the water. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Mark reached for it slowly, almost as if he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. The screen lit up with a familiar name, _Carlos Ortega_. Mark hesitated for a moment before swiping to answer. "Pang," he said, his voice hoarse. He hadn't spoken much to anyone lately, and his voice felt like it hadn't been used in days. "Mark." Carlos's voice came through, warm and steady, but with an undercurrent of concern. "How are you doing?" Mark leaned back against the pillows, closing his eyes for a moment as he considered the question. "I'm getting by," he said finally. "But I don't know, Carlos. I don't feel like I'm really admitting. Everything just feels off." Carlos was quiet for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. "It's been a hell of a month, man. I get it. But you can't keep avoiding it. You've got to face it. You can't just lock yourself away in here forever." Mark opened his eyes and looked at the window again. The view of the water just beyond the buildings. The ocean was beautiful from here, but all it did was remind him of what had happened. "I don't know if I can go back out there," Mark said quietly, his voice cracked with the rawness of the truth. "The thought of getting in the water again, I don't think I can do it." "I know it's tough," Carlos said, his voice softening, "but running from it won't help. You've got to face the fear. The ocean, the sharks, it's all a part of you now. It's been part of you for a long time. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise it'll get better." Mark was silent for a long moment, the weight of Carlos's words sinking in. He didn't know if he could ever feel safe again, not after what had happened. He had been in love with the ocean for so long, but now, it felt like a foreign, hostile place. It was as if the water had betrayed him. "I'm not sure where to start," Mark said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You start by taking it one day at a time, Carlos replied, his voice steady. You've made it this far. You're already on the road to recovery, even if it doesn't feel like it. But you don't have to rush it. Take it slow. You can do this. Mark sighed, a heavy, resigned sound. Maybe. Carlos didn't press the issue. Instead, he shifted the conversation. Listen, I've been talking to some of the dive shops around here. We've got some new safety measures in place, and the authorities are monitoring the shark situation closely. But more importantly, I think it might help if you just get out there. You don't have to dive. Just come with me. We can take it slow. It's all about regaining that confidence, little by little. Mark sat up straighter at the suggestion. The idea of even being near the water again made his stomach churn. But the thought of sitting in his apartment day after day, locked away in fear, felt even worse. I don't know, Mark trailed off. He wasn't sure he could even bear the sight of the ocean at this point. The thought of stepping back into those waters was suffocating. I'll be there with you, Carlos said firmly. We don't have to do anything extreme, just a walk on the beach. You don't have to get in the water, but it might help, and I'll be right there. Mark looked out the window again. The water glistened under the sun, a beautiful, deceptive scene that made his chest tighten. Okay, Mark said, his voice barely audible. I'll come, but only if we take it slow. Carlos's voice was filled with relief. That's all I'm asking. Just take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this, Mark. The next morning, Mark and Carlos met at a small cafe near the beach. Mark's leg was still stiff from the injury, but he managed to walk with his crutches, leaning on them heavily for support. Carlos was waiting for him at the cafe, a coffee in hand and a concerned look on his face. You sure you want to do this? Carlos asked as Mark sat down. We can always just grab some food and talk instead. Mark hesitated but then shook his head. I need to try. I can't keep avoiding it forever, but I don't think I'm ready to dive yet. Maybe just sitting by the water for a while. Carlos nodded, understanding. We'll take it slow, like we said. The cafe was quiet, with only a few tourists and locals scattered around, enjoying breakfast or chatting. The ocean, just visible in the distance, beckoned beyond the buildings, its waves rolling gently against the shore. It seemed peaceful, but Mark could feel the tension in his muscles, the fear lingering beneath the surface. Carlos finished his coffee and stood up. Come on, we'll walk along the shore. Naros. They walked slowly toward the beach, Mark's crutches tapping softly against the pavement with each step. The sand stretched out before them, the ocean on one side, the city on the other. Mark could feel the weight of his fears pressing down on him as they approached the water's edge. He stopped a few feet from the shoreline, the waves rolling up onto the sand with a soft, rhythmic sound. Carlos looked over at him, waiting, but saying nothing. Mark felt his heart pounding in his chest as he stared out at the water. It looked so calm, so inviting, but all he could remember was the violence of the shark attack, the feeling of being helpless and trapped. I don't know if I can do it, Mark whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Carlos walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, but I'm here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. Mark closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs. For a long moment he just stood there, his mind racing. The waves lapped at his feet, a gentle reminder that the ocean was still there, waiting. But he was different now. The ocean had taken something from him, but it had also given him so much. The two were inseparable, its beauty, its danger, its power. And now, in this moment, Mark had to decide if he was going to let fear dictate his life, or if he was going to reclaim his place in the world he had always loved. I don't know if I'll ever dive again, Mark said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. Carlos turned to face him fully, his eyes kind but firm. That's okay. You don't have to dive again if you don't want to. But that doesn't mean the ocean has to be your enemy. The still part of you, and it always will be. Mark took another breath, his hand tightening on the crutch. The ocean seemed to stretch out before him, vast and endless. But he wasn't alone. Carlos was there beside him, his presence steady and comforting. It wasn't a guarantee that Mark would ever dive again, but it was a promise that he wouldn't be alone in this fight. "I think I can do this," Mark said, a small but significant spark of resolve in his voice. "I can't stay in fear forever." Carlos smiled, a relieved and understanding smile. "That's the spirit." Mark turned back toward the water, feeling the warm breeze against his skin. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars, both physical and mental, would take time to heal. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let the ocean win. He would find his way back, step by step, until the water was no longer a source of terror but a reminder of his strength, of his ability to survive. And with Carlos by his side, he knew he could take that first step. "Let's take a walk," Mark said, his voice steady. "Slowly, like you said." Carlos grinned, and together, they walked along the beach, the ocean's gentle waves lapping at their feet. One step at a time, Mark sat on the edge of the boat, his hands gripping the sides as the engine hummed steadily, cutting through the waves. The familiar sound of the ocean's rhythmic swell filled the air, mixing with the occasional call of a gull soaring overhead. The air smelled of salt and freedom, of a world that had once felt like home. But today, the smell of the sea brought with it a rush of fear and apprehension that Mark couldn't shake. He hadn't been in the water in almost 2 months, and despite the calmness of the day, he could feel the weight of every single moment since the attack pressing down on him. Carlos was standing beside him, his hands adjusting the gear on the boat. Mark could feel his friend's eyes on him, the quiet understanding in the way he watched him without saying a word. It was as though Carlos was giving him the space he needed to process, but also subtly reminding him that he wasn't alone. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had made the decision. This was the day. He had to face it. He couldn't keep running from the ocean, from the shark, from himself. But the fear that had been planted in him during that attack still clung to him like a second skin. It felt suffocating. His body wanted to move, wanted to escape back to the safety of the shore. But he knew if he let that fear control him now, he'd never step into the water again. He glanced over at Carlos, who was adjusting the motor on the boat, then quickly looking back at Mark. Carlos had said this was the first step, just getting back out there. He didn't need to dive. Just getting close to the water, feeling it again, was enough. Carlos had promised they'd take it slow, and Mark trusted him. He wasn't alone. "We're almost there," Carlos said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, reassuring. Mark appreciated that. Carlos wasn't pushing him. He was giving him the space to make his own decision. Mark nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." It had taken time, but he had slowly come to terms with what had happened. He had gone to therapy, worked through the panic attacks that had plagued him in the weeks following the attack, and even started a routine of physical therapy to regain his strength. His leg was still weak, and his arm had scars from the wounds, but they were healing. What had been hardest to heal, however, were the scars inside. The fear that remained whenever he thought about the ocean, the vast, open space that had once felt like his second home, now seemed like an enemy. But he was ready to take that first step back. He had to. He couldn't live his life in fear, paralyzed by what had happened. If he was ever going to find peace again, it started now on this boat. The boat rocked gently as they approached the dive site, a spot near the shallow reef that was popular with tourists but far from where the shark had attacked. Mark's pulse quickened as the boat slowed. His eyes moved over the water, watching the way the waves lapped gently against the hull. It all looked so peaceful, so calm, and yet, beneath the surface, he knew it held the potential for danger. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Carlos turned to him, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "We don't have to go any further if you're not ready," Carlos said gently. "We can just stay here." We'll watch the water, listen to the waves. You're in control today, Mark. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel the fear creeping in again, the old memories trying to surface. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing himself to center himself. He could hear his heartbeat thumping in his ears, but he tried to focus on the calmness of the moment. It wasn't the shark that was the problem, it was the fear. That was the real enemy, not the water, not the creatures beneath the surface, but the fear that had gripped him after the attack. I want to go in, Mark said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. I can do this, slowly, but I can do it. Carlos nodded, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. That's what I like to hear. We take it one step at a time. If you need to stop, we stop. But you're ready. Mark glanced over at the crew on the boat, other divers who had joined them for the day. He had chosen a private trip, not wanting to face a crowd, and the crew had respected his wishes. Everyone was here to help him through this moment, giving him space but supporting him all the same. Mark appreciated that. He was one less thing to worry about. Carlos handed him the mask and snorkel, the gear feeling familiar and strange in his hands. It had been months since he'd used them, months since he had dived into the depths, feeling the weightlessness of the ocean, the sense of freedom that had once felt like an extension of himself. He had loved that feeling, the peace, the quiet, the sense that he was part of something much larger than himself. But now, the thought of submerging into that same vastness made his stomach churn. But this was the first step. Carlos helped Mark get suited up, ensuring that everything was tight and secure, and then handed him the fins. Mark felt the weight of the wetsuit, the tightness of the gear on his body, and it felt different. It wasn't the same as before. It felt foreign, like he was wearing someone else's skin. He was stepping back into the world he had once loved, but it was a world that had changed for him. The sharks, the deep water, the darkness beneath the surface, he would never see it the same way again. Are you ready? Carlos asked, his voice gentle, almost coaxing. Mark nodded, though his throat was dry again, his heart pounding as he gripped the side of the boat. He stared at the water, watching the way the sunlight reflected off the surface, the gentle ripples caused by the boat's movement. The ocean seemed to stretch endlessly before him, both beautiful and terrifying. I'm ready, Mark said, though the words felt almost too final, as if he was jumping off a cliff into the unknown. The boat rocked slightly as Carlos gave him a reassuring smile. Then let's get in the water. Carlos was the first to slip into the water, his movements smooth and effortless. He turned back to Mark, giving him a thumbs up, as if to say, "This is it." Mark stood at the edge of the boat, his legs trembling slightly beneath him. He took another deep breath, steadying himself. He could hear his pulse in his ears, feel the rush of adrenaline flooding his system. One step, one moment at a time. He could do this. Okay, he muttered to himself, more for reassurance than anything else. Okay. With a deep breath, Mark stepped off the edge of the boat, his body sinking into the water below. The cold embrace of the ocean surrounded him, and for a moment, everything seemed to still. He floated there for a second, just beneath the surface, his head breaking through the water as he took in the air. The sun above, the gentle rocking of the boat, the sound of the waves, all of it was so peaceful, so calm. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe deeply, evenly. Felt strange, but not in the way he had expected. The fear wasn't as overwhelming as he had imagined. It was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but he was in control now. His body was adjusting, his breath was slowing. Good job. Carlos's voice came from just beneath him, steady and calm. You're doing great. Just take it slow. Mark nodded, his mouthpiece securely in place as he adjusted his mask. He began to kick slowly, his body moving in sync with the water. His legs still ached with every movement, but it was manageable. The water was warm, a comforting contrast to the stiffness in his limbs. Carlos swam next to him, guiding him further out, but keeping a careful distance. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, giving Mark plenty of space to move at his own pace. Mark felt the tension in his shoulders slowly begin to melt away, the water supporting him, making him feel lighter than he had in weeks. The fear was still there, like a shadow, but it wasn't overpowering anymore. The longer he stayed in the water, the more he realized that the ocean, the water, it wasn't what had hurt him. It was the shark, and the shark was no longer here. As they swam farther from the boat, the clarity of the water became more apparent. The bright sunlight filtered through the water, illuminating the sandy bottom below, the coral formations rising like ancient cities beneath the surface. The world was quiet here, peaceful, as if the ocean had allowed Mark to return on its terms, at his pace. Mark stopped for a moment, his hand hovering over the water's surface, letting the gentle waves wash over his fingers. His chest was tight, his breath shallow, but he felt calm. He wasn't sure if he would ever feel like his old self again. But this moment, this quiet peace of the ocean, was enough. "You're doing great," Carlos said again, his voice light. "How are you feeling?" Mark turned toward him, his face breaking into a small, tentative smile. "I'm okay. More than okay, actually." Carlos grinned, his eyes lighting up. "Told you, man. It's all about taking it one step at a time." For the first time since the attack, Mark felt a sense of peace wash over him. He was back in the water, not diving, not pushing himself to explore the depths, but just being. The ocean, with all its power, its danger, and its beauty, wasn't his enemy. It never had been. The shark had been a singular moment of terror, a moment that had almost taken everything from him. But it hadn't. Mark was still here. He was still alive. And that, he realized, was enough. Carlos motioned toward the boat. "How about we head back? We can take a break. Relax for a bit." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the past months lift from his shoulders, if only for a moment. He wasn't sure what the future held, whether he would ever dive again, but he didn't need to know. He was taking it one step at a time. Together, they swam back to the boat, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was finally finding his way back to the man he had once been. Slowly but surely, one step at a time,